We've seen that Aristotle's focus on the function, the goals, and the good led to a conclusion that a good life is one where humans flourish, that what we want is this flourishing. And in order to flourish, we need to act in accordance with a set of virtues, which is what we were doing in the last video. This idea of most virtues, with the exception of justice, being on a golden mean between two vices, right? Now the question becomes, the fourth area that we're going to look at is how do we develop these virtues? So if we want to lead a better life and become better people, what is it we need to be able to do? Let's get into it. So you'll remember that Aristotle broke virtues into two different kinds, the intellectual virtues and the character-related virtues. And what he's saying is that the intellectual virtues are developed differently to the character-related or moral virtues. So intellectual virtues can be learnt through education and training. For instance, you gain knowledge about business through doing a business degree, or you can learn it on the job is another way that we develop these particular intellectual virtues. In contrast, character-related, or the moral virtues we're most interested in, can't simply be taught. In fact, what we have to do is use them repeatedly. Okay, so they're actually habit formation. That's the way we can develop these particular character traits, these moral virtues. Aristotle points out that this is a lifelong process. It's not like a particular piece of education where you can hit a point and say you've known enough. We continue to develop these virtues. I should also say that intellectual attributes are those you continue to develop too, but I often think we can see standards that we hit along the way. Whereas with virtues, it's this constant approach to try and live a better life, try and live out these virtues. What's important are things that influence us, right? And things that shape our habits. Okay. So what kinds of things shape our habits? Well, the environment we're brought up in, family, friends, school, religion, all those things begin to shape our habits and what we value and how we approach many of these virtues. What's another important thing for us to think about are our mentors or role models. So when you actually get into business, you'll hear a lot about leadership being modeling, okay? And Aristotle is developing this idea of us wanting to be or aspiring to be like these role models. So whenever you ask yourself, what would X do? Doesn't matter who X is. Some use great historical figures, some use religious figures, etc. If you're thinking that way, you're thinking in terms of virtue ethics. Right? Because what you're thinking about are the attributes or the role model about how to deal with this particular situation. You're thinking about who you consider to be a virtuous actor. So again, having role models and mentors, having an environment that shapes us to act in a virtuous way are considered important elements of developing the character virtues. Just like our other approaches to ethics, there's a number of strengths to virtue ethics. Okay, so the first one is it gives us this broader range of tools with which to judge a particular situation that we're in. The second thing is there's a nice blend here of logic and emotion, right? So most of the other two, the utilitarianism and Kant's approach that we used, they basically rely on logic and almost overcoming our emotions, whereas Aristotle is incorporating this into the overarching approach if you look back on it. The third kind of key strength that we see in Aristotle's approach is that it provides for a complexity of situation, right? He's not actually saying here's this one approach all the time, etc., that we should use. And that's what really happens in the decision rules of deontological and consequentialist approaches that we've used thus far. He's saying, look, you have to use this practical wisdom to judge the situation for this person in this context in order to work it out. So it probably is a lot more real life in that complexity that it brings into the decision process. And just like our other approaches to ethics, there's a number of challenges. Why don't we have a look at them? So the first one is that it actually doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't tell us what to do. We've kind of got to work it out with our practical wisdom. So in some sense, it isn't very specific and may not be helpful if we can't do that. The second area where there's some issues is something in common with a lot of the other frameworks, and it doesn't consider dilemmas. Like, what do you do when you have a conflict between two virtues? Okay, which one do you choose? It's silent about that, other than, practical wisdom. Also, the other problem that we may have is that virtues may not always be good. And the example that we've used a few times is that someone from a negative or from what we would consider an unethical organisation, etc., or in an unethical context, might actually display virtues. Courage and loyalty might be attributes of people who do well in the mafia, etc. Okay, so that's it for Aristotle's approach to virtue ethics. You remember there are 4 key things for you to get your head around. Number 1, the idea of function, goals, and the good. Number 2, what we mean by flourishing in the context of a human, acting in alignment with the virtues. Number 3, the virtues, how they operate, the idea of the golden mean. And 4, how we develop those virtues. Of course, as in common with all the other frameworks that we've done, look at the strengths and weaknesses. Next, we're going to move on to a bit more of a descriptive, it is a descriptive framework around the ethical agent, Kohlberg's theory of moral development.